A week later, he still could not meet her eyes. It was a small thing to watch, if you happened to be at the counter that afternoon, and knew where to look. A young soldier in a clean shirt held the diner door open against the wind, and a woman in a plain red jacket stepped through it, and the soldier looked at the floor tiles as if his name were written there. He did not speak. He did not lift his gaze. He held the door the way a man holds something he is afraid to drop. And when she had passed, he let it fall shut and stood a moment with his hand still on the glass. To understand why a corporal would rather study the floor than a woman's face, you have to go back to the rain. You have to go back to the afternoon he called her a waitress. "Hey, waitress, 2 coffees, and try to keep up." The words came out easy, the way cruelty comes easy to a young man performing for other young men. Corporal Bryce Ledford snapped his fingers twice, the sound sharp over the hiss of the grill, and pointed at the woman sitting alone at the counter. He did not look at her when he said it. He was already turning back to the 2 soldiers in the corner booth, already grinning, sure that the afternoon belonged to him. The woman did not turn around. The diner sat 2 miles from the front gate of the post, a long chrome and vinyl box with a counter down one side and 6 booths down the other, and rain came sliding down the front windows in slow gray sheets. It was the middle of the afternoon, the dead hour between lunch and supper, and the only sounds were the grill, the rain, and 3 young men who had nowhere to be for 2 hours and had chosen to spend them here. A waitress named Dana was out back on a smoke break. The woman at the counter had a cup of coffee going cold in front of her and a newspaper folded into a neat square by her right hand. She sat very still. That was the first thing about her, though the corporal never saw it. She had a way of sitting that made the room seem to arrange itself around her, a stillness that was not the stillness of tiredness or age, but of something held in reserve. When she had come in, 20 minutes earlier, she had chosen the stool at the end of the counter without seeming to choose it, the one with her back to the wall and her eyes on the door. She had marked the exits the way another person marks the weather, without thinking, out of a habit worn so deep it had stopped being a habit and become the shape of her. Her hands were quiet. Her eyes moved once around the room and then settled, and after that, she was as motionless as the coat rack. She had ordered nothing but the coffee. When Dana had come by with the pot and the menu, 20 minutes before the corporal ever opened his mouth, the woman had said only, "Just the coffee. Thank you," and had said it in a way that made Dana straighten a little without knowing why, and had not touched the menu at all. She had wrapped both hands around the cup when it came, not to drink it but to warm them, and she had looked out at the rain for a while, and then she had unfolded the newspaper and read it slowly, 1 column at a time, the way a person reads who has learned that most things are not worth hurrying toward. She did not check a phone. She did not tap a foot. She did none of the small, restless things that people do to fill a quiet hour. She simply sat and drank her coffee and let the afternoon go by around her, and was so completely unremarkable that she had become, in the way of truly still things, almost invisible. Which was, the corporal would later understand, exactly the point of her. Behind the counter, at the flat top, a big gray-haired man named Leon Pretty had gone still, too. He was 63 years old, and he owned the place, and he had been cooking eggs and burgers on that griddle for 19 years, and before that, he had done 2 tours with the Ranger Regiment, and there were things a man learned in those years that never left him. One of them was how to read a room. He had watched the woman in the red jacket come in and cross to the end stool, and something in the way she did it had made the hair on his arms lift, and he had not known why, and he had been trying to place it ever since. Now he stood with a spatula in his hand, and eggs going brown on the griddle he had forgotten, and he watched the corporal snap his fingers at her, and he watched her not turn around, and he thought, no waitress in the world sits like that. "Waitress," Ledford tried again, louder. "You deaf? 2 coffees." The woman lifted her cup, took a small swallow, and set it down. She still had not looked at him, and in the silence that followed, small and stretched, Leon Pretty felt the afternoon tilt very slightly, the way a floor tilts under a truck that is heavier than it looks. She had a way of being in a room that made the room smaller around her, and louder men never noticed until it was too late. Ledford laughed and shook his head, and turned back to his friends, and the show went on. The one thing every man in that corner booth agreed on, later, was that none of them had any idea. Specialist Cody Ray had been telling a story. He was 22, thick through the shoulders, with a way of talking that assumed the room was listening whether it was or not. And the story was about a firefight he had heard about from a man who had heard about it from a man. And by the time it reached Ray's mouth, it had grown a third act and lost all its facts. He told it big, hands moving, and Ledford egged him on. And the third soldier, a private first class named Micah Sear, 20 years old and quiet, sat at the edge of the booth and laughed when he was supposed to, and watched the door. The woman at the counter spoke without turning. "It was 800 meters, she said. Not 3. And the call came from the east." She said it quietly, almost to the coffee cup, the way a person corrects a small error out of long habit and no wish to be heard. But the diner was small, and the rain was steady, and every man in the booth heard it. Ray stopped with his hands in the air. He looked at his friends, then back at the woman, uncertain whether to be angry or amused. "What?" "The story you're telling," the woman said. "You have it turned around. That ridge runs north to south. The fire came from the east, downhill, in the last light. Not 300 meters. 8. She turned her cup a quarter turn on its saucer. "Whoever told it to you was standing the wrong way when he heard it too." For a moment, no one said anything. Sear looked at her, the way you look at a stranger who has said your middle name. There was a thing in her voice, flat and certain, that did not belong to a woman guessing. It belonged to a woman remembering. Because that was the difference, and Sear felt it before he could have explained it. A person telling a story they have heard reaches for the drama of it, the noise, the fear, the size of the thing. A person telling a story they lived reaches for the geography, the distance, the direction of the light, which way the ground fell away, and where the fire came from, and how many meters lay between one bad moment and the next. The woman at the counter had corrected a distance and a direction, the two things a soldier who was actually there never forgets, and a soldier who wasn't never knows. And she had done it the way you correct a child who has your own address slightly wrong, patiently, and without any doubt at all. Leon Pretty set a fresh cup of coffee down in front of her that she had not ordered. "On the house," he said. She looked up at him then, only for a second, and gave him a small nod. Not the nod of a customer to a cook, but something squarer, more deliberate, a soldier's economy of thanks. And Pretty, who had spent 2 tours learning to read exactly that, felt the hair lift on his arms again. He noticed how she folded the newspaper into quarters and squared its edge with 2 fingers. He noticed that she kept her right forearm turned in toward the counter, sleeve down at the wrist, as if the arm were carrying something she did not want seen. "Nobody asked you, sweetheart," Ledford said. He had recovered his grin, but it had cost him something, and that made him meaner. He did not like being corrected by the help. He did not like the way his own private had looked at her. "Clear my table when you get a minute," he said. "There's a good girl." Pretty wiped a clean spot on the counter twice and watched the corporal decide to make an afternoon of it, and felt the floor tilt another degree. It got social, the way these things do. Ledford had an audience of 2 and a target who would not fight back, and for a certain kind of young man, that is all the permission the world needs to give. He christened her first. Grandma's helper, he called her, pleased with himself, and Ray laughed the big laugh, and even Sear managed a thin smile, because the alternative was to be the one who didn't. Ledford leaned back in the booth and narrated her to the room, where she'd probably worked, how long she'd probably been bussing tables, the whole imagined smallness of her life. "Look at her," he said. "Probably been carrying trays since before I was born." The woman drank her coffee. That was the thing that got under his skin in the end. Not defiance. Defiance he would have known what to do with. It was the drinking of the coffee, the turning of the newspaper, the complete and unbothered calm of a person who has decided you are weather and will pass. He got up, crossed to the counter, and with a flick of 2 fingers, swept her folded newspaper off the edge and onto the floor. It landed with its soft slap in the wet tracked in from the door. She did not bend for it. She did not look at it. She let it lie there and kept her hands around her cup, and something in the stillness of her, while the paper lay in the dirty water, was worse than any answer she could have given. Down at the end of the counter, an older trucker who had been nursing a coffee and minding his own business put $2 under his saucer, stood up, put on his cap, and walked out into the rain rather than watch any more of it. The bell over the door rang once behind him. The shame in the room had become general, the way it does when good people decide the cost of stepping in is higher than the cost of looking away. And still she did not react, and that was the strange gravity of it, that the longer she declined to be provoked, the more the shame settled onto everyone else. A woman who wept would have given the room somewhere to put its feeling. A woman who shouted would have made it a fight, and a fight has 2 sides, and people can pick one. But a woman who simply sat and drank her coffee and let a boy sweep her newspaper into the dirt without so much as tightening her jaw, that gave the room nowhere to look but at itself. Ray had stopped laughing. Even he could feel it now, the way the air had gone wrong, though he could not have said what had changed. Only Ledford, out at the front of it, too committed to feel anything but the need to win, kept pushing. Leon Pretty started around the end of the counter, and the woman in the red jacket said, without raising her voice, 3 words that were not a threat, and landed harder than one. "You'll want to stop." Ledford blinked. Then he smiled, wide and delighted, because being told to stop was the best thing that had happened to him all day. If you have ever watched the young forget what the old once paid, watched a person be made small by someone who had no idea what they were standing in front of, then stay with this one. Subscribe to the Veteran Vault and let the rest of it find you. Ledford leaned across the counter toward her, still smiling, and reached for her arm. Oh, it turned then, the way weather turns. Not all at once, but past the point of stopping. Ledford grabbed the back of her stool and spun it a quarter turn, so that she faced him whether she wished to or not. "Up," he said. "Hop too. My table's not going to clear itself, and you're standing here like you own the place." She rode the spin. That was the moment Leon Pretty would come back to, afterward, more than the tattoo, more than anything that came later. The corporal spun the stool hard enough to slop coffee out of a careless woman's cup, and she came around with it and did not spill a drop. Her center never moved. The cup stayed level in her hand, as if it were fixed to the counter, and the room had turned beneath it. It was a small thing, and it was the wrong thing, entirely wrong. A balance that belonged to no tired waitress in the world, and Pretty saw it and felt his stomach drop. "Son," Pretty said, low, from behind the counter. "Leave it." Ledford waved a hand at him without looking. "Stay out of it, chef. Man." CR had a hand on Ray's sleeve. His voice had gone quiet and unsure. "Let's just go. Formation's in a couple hours. Let's go." He could not have told you what he was afraid of. That was what would eat at him later. Lying awake. That he had felt the danger in the room a full minute before he had any reason to. That his body had known something his mind had not caught up to. He had watched her ride the spin of the stool without spilling the coffee, and some old instinct at the base of his skull had said, quietly and with total certainty, that this was not a woman you wanted to put your hands on. He tugged at Ray's sleeve again. Ray shook him off, but Ray was grinning, and Ledford was committed. And a young man committed in front of an audience is a hard thing to turn. Ledford put both hands on the counter on either side of her and leaned in close. The woman set her cup down. She squared her shoulders, slowly, and turned her right forearm in toward her body, the covered arm, the sleeve at the wrist, and for the first time she looked directly at him. Her eyes were pale and level and completely without fear, and they did not flinch, and something in the back of the corporal's mind, some old animal part that his mouth had not yet consulted, went quietly cold. "I'm looking at a waitress with an attitude," Ledford said to himself as much as to her, as if saying it could make it so. "You don't know what you're looking at," Pretty said. And Ledford closed his hand around her right wrist to haul her up off the stool. The sleeve began to move. Pretty came around the counter. He was a big man, and 63 years old, and he had a bad knee. But he came around the end of that counter faster than any of them expected, and he put himself at the corner of it, close, one hand flat on the chrome. He had seen something as the sleeve shifted under the corporal's grip, the edge of it, a curve of black ink high on the inside of her forearm, and it had put 20 years and 2 tours into his chest all at once. "Son," he said. His voice had changed. It was not the voice of a cook anymore. "You have no idea who that is." Ledford laughed, but it came out shorter than he wanted. "It's a waitress, old man." "I did 2 tours with the regiment," Pretty said. He was talking to all 3 of them now, low and steady, the way you talk to men standing on something that is about to give way under them. "2. And I have spent my whole life since learning how to stop seeing it, and I still see it. And I am telling you, I have not been able to take my eyes off this woman since she walked in that door. Look at how she sat down. Look at where she chose to sit. She cleared this whole room with her eyes in about 2 seconds, and then she never moved again. You don't learn that waiting tables." He looked at Ledford's hand around her wrist. "Let go of her arm." For 1 second, something flickered behind Ledford's face. Doubt, the first cold breath of it. Then his pride closed over it, because he was 22, and he had 2 men watching, and he could not be the one who backed down over a waitress. He tightened his grip instead, to prove he wasn't afraid, and something ugly and stubborn set his jaw. The woman spoke, and she did not speak to him. "Leon." She had read his name off the license framed by the register, or off 19 years of it hanging in the air, or off nothing at all. "Sit down. This is mine." Pretty stopped. Pretty looked at her, and something passed between the 2 of them that the boys could not read. The recognition of one who had carried it for another who still did. He had known men like her. He had followed 1 or 2. He had spent 19 years flipping eggs precisely because he had wanted, more than anything, to spend the back half of his life around ordinary people doing ordinary things. And here was the extraordinary, walked in off the street in a red jacket, and every instinct he had was screaming at him to stand between her and the boy. And she was telling him, gently, that she did not need him to. "I don't want you in it," she said, quieter, only for him. "You've done enough. You saw. That's enough." And to the corporal, level and final. "Let go of my arm." Pretty held her eyes a second longer. Then he stepped back to the corner of the counter and put his hands flat on the chrome and made himself still, because she had given him an order without giving him an order, and 40 years fell away, and he found he still knew how to take one. What the boy in the pressed uniform did not know is what the next few minutes were about to teach him, the kind of lesson a man carries the rest of his life. Subscribe so you don't miss the moment it lands. Ledford tightened his grip and pulled. To know what the black ink meant, you have to leave the diner and the rain and go back 14 years to a valley on the other side of the world, in the cold and the dark. The Panjshir ran north and south between mountains that held the last of the snow into summer, and on a night in the spring of 2012, the air was thin and freezing and smelled of dust and diesel, and a Ranger assault force moved up a terraced hillside toward a compound that was not supposed to know they were coming. First Lieutenant Colette Hargrove was 27 years old that night. She moved near the front of the element with her rifle up and her breath smoking, and the plan was good, and the intelligence was good, and for 11 minutes everything went the way it was drawn. Then a dog barked, or a man coughed, or nothing at all happened that anyone could ever name, and the hillside came apart in light. Fire came down on them from the high ground to the east, from a spur no one had cleared, and it came heavy, and men went to the dirt behind the low stone walls of the terraces, and the night filled with the flat, hard cracks of it echoing off the rock. Hargrove got her element into cover and got the fire back, going the right direction. And she was calm. That was the thing the men remembered about her, the ones who lived, that she was calm, and the withdrawal was working, one terrace at a time, when Sergeant Isaiah Meade stood up to lay down covering fire for the two men behind him and took a round through the side. He went down hard against the stone. She reached him first. He was 26 years old, and he had a wife back home and a mother who wrote him letters, and he looked up at her in the strobing dark, and he already knew. The way men who take that kind of hit know, and he told her to leave him. "Leave me, ma'am." His voice was small under the noise. "You have to leave me. Get them out." "Not tonight, Sergeant," she said. "Not any night." She got a pressure dressing onto the wound, with hands that did not shake, and she called it in. And she reorganized the withdrawal around the fact of one man who could not walk. And she did all of it in the same flat, calm voice she used for everything, because she had learned a long time before that a leader's fear travels faster than any radio, and that the men would be exactly as steady as she let herself appear. Two of them wanted to take Meade in turns. She told them no. She needed every rifle facing the right way and every hand free, and there was only one person in that element whose job could be given to someone else for the next 4 kilometers, and that person was the one giving the orders. And she got him up onto her back, and she carried him. The extraction point was 4 kilometers down the valley over ground that had never been kind to anything, broken rock and dry watercourses and terraces that dropped away in the dark, and she carried him the whole way. When she could not carry him, she dragged him. When the fire found them, she put him behind a wall with her own body and waited it out, and then she got him up again. She talked to him the entire distance, a low, steady stream of it, his name and where they were going and what he was going to eat when they got home. Not because she thought talking would keep him alive, but because she would not let the last voice he heard be the guns. Her hands were slick, and her lungs were burning in the thin air, and she did not stop. The valley did not make it easy. Twice the ground opened in front of her in the dark, and she nearly went down a terrace wall with him. And twice she found the drop with her lead foot, and turned her shoulder, and took the fall on her own body instead of his. A dry stream bed ran the middle of the low ground, all round loose stones that rolled under a boot, and she crossed it on her knees rather than risk her feet, dragging him across the rocks with her arms hooked under his and her back to the enemy the whole way. She counted the distance to herself as she went, the way she had been taught, breaking 4 impossible kilometers into 100 possible steps, and then another 100, because a person can always take one more step, and the trick of surviving the unbearable is to never ask yourself to bear all of it at once. Somewhere behind them, the guns kept working, and the ridge kept flashing, and the rest of her men leapfrogged back in good order because their lieutenant had not run, and so neither would they. "Stay with me, Isaiah," she said over and over into the cold. "One more. Just one more. We're almost to the birds. Stay with me." The birds came in low with their lights out, and the rotor wash flattened the grass and threw grit like a storm, and the landing zone was hot, and the door gunners were working, and she got him to the edge of it and went down on her knees with him in her arms in the hurricane of the rotors. He died there. Minutes short. His head against her shoulder and her hand flat on his chest, and she felt the last of it go out of him, with the wind screaming around them and the aircraft waiting. And she held her hand there one beat too long, one beat that was hers and not the mission's, and then she stood up and got the last of her men aboard and did not leave until every one of them was on before her. There is a kind of arithmetic that officers learn and never speak of, in which one man weighed against the mission is supposed to come out a certain way. And she had run that arithmetic 100 times in training and knew every clean answer it gave. And on the floor of that valley, she had looked at all of it and set it down, because there was a thing underneath the arithmetic that the arithmetic could not touch, and the thing was this: that a sergeant had trusted her with his life, and that trust wasn't a variable you were allowed to solve for. She had told him she would not leave him. She had meant it as a fact, not a comfort. And she had made it true. At a cost, she would carry the rest of her life, and she had never once in 14 years called the cost a mistake. They gave her the Silver Star for that night. She never displayed it. What she kept instead was inked high on the inside of her right forearm, small and black, the regiment's scroll, and beneath it a single set of initials, and she wore her sleeves down over it, because it was not a thing to show, it was a thing to carry. And she had gone to a small house in another state, and sat with a woman named Verna Meade, and told her the truth about her son, and had carried that too. And both of them together were the ballast under all her stillness, the weight that made her so hard to move. 14 years later, in a diner in the rain, a boy who had not been born long when Isaiah Meade died closed his hand around that forearm and pulled. He hauled her up off the stool. She came up. She let him bring her up. That was the thing, that she permitted it. And she came up balanced and centered and entirely under her own control, her weight already where it needed to be, so that a man watching closely would have understood in an instant that she wasn't being lifted at all, but was choosing, for reasons of her own, to rise. She did not resist. She did not strike. She rose the way a wall rises when you lean on it, and Corporal Ledford, who had expected to yank a small, tired woman off her seat, found instead that he had taken hold of something that moved only because it decided to. And in the motion, the red sleeve slid down. It slid from her wrist to her elbow in one smooth fall of cloth, and for 3 full seconds, the inside of her right forearm was plain to every person at that counter. The black scroll. The shape every man who had worn it would know in the dark, in a photograph, in a glance across a crowded room. The arc of the letters, and under it the 2 small initials she had carried for 14 years. Leon Priddy said 4 quiet words. "That's a Ranger scroll." The temperature of the room dropped. You could feel it go. Micah Seor came half out of the booth, his face gone the color of paper, because he was a young soldier, and he knew exactly what that curve of ink meant, and exactly what it meant that a corporal had his hand around the arm that wore it. Cody Ray, who had been grinning through the whole thing, set his coffee down very carefully, as if any sudden motion might make the moment more true. The big laugh was gone. There was no sound in the diner, but the rain and the grill. Ledford looked at the ink. He looked at her face, and for the first time he met a pair of eyes that did not move, did not soften, did not offer him the fear he had been feeding on all afternoon. eyes that simply looked back at him, level and patient and old in a way that had nothing to do with years, and waited. There is a moment in the reveal of a thing long hidden when the person who has been wrong gets one last chance to understand it quietly before the world understands it for him and takes the choice away. Ledford stood inside that moment now. The ink was on the arm. The cook had named it. His own private had gone white and come to his feet. Every signal a young soldier is trained to read was firing at once, and all he had to do was let go and step back and let the afternoon end, with nothing worse than his own private shame. Some part of him knew it. Some part of him always would, and would wish he had listened. But he was 22, and his pride had gotten him this far, and pride does not know how to let go of an arm. He held on 1 second too long. "Let go of my arm, Corporal," she said. "I won't ask twice." The bell over the door rang. A big man came in out of the rain in an army uniform, shaking the water off his cover, and got 2 steps into the diner before he stopped as if he had walked into glass. Command Sergeant Major Dwayne Osteen had come in for his coffee. He came in every afternoon at that hour, on his way through, because Pretty's was the only place inside 10 miles that made it the way he liked it, and he was 51 years old, and had 30 years in, and there was very little left in the world that could surprise him. He got 2 steps inside, out of the rain, and his eyes swept the room the way a senior man's eyes always sweep a room, and they crossed the counter, and they stopped. They stopped on a forearm. Then they went to a face. And Command Sergeant Major Osteen, who did not spend his respect cheaply, who had made 3 young soldiers wet themselves with a look, and had stood at the shoulder of generals without blinking, came to attention in the middle of a diner floor. "Major Hargrove," he said. The words fell into the silence like stones into a well. "Ma'am?" He was still standing at attention. He had not decided to. His body had decided for him, the way a body does around certain names. "It's an honor. I didn't know you were in the area." For a long moment, no one moved. Ledford's hand was still half raised in the air where her wrist had been. She had removed it from his grip somewhere in the last few seconds, gently, without anyone quite seeing how. And he stood frozen with it there, and his face began to go through its seasons. Confusion first, the word major refusing to fit the woman he had spent an hour calling waitress. Then disbelief, a small, desperate shake of the head, because it could not be, because he would not have, because the whole afternoon could not have been what it was, now revealing itself to have been. Then recognition, cold and total, the 2 facts slamming together at last, the scroll and the name and the Command Sergeant Major standing at attention, into a single unbearable understanding. And then horror. "Corporal." Osteen had turned his head, and his voice had dropped to something quiet and terrible. "Do you know who you have been speaking to?" He did not wait for an answer. He spoke to the whole room, flat and unhurried, the way a man reads a citation. "This is Major Colette Hargrove, 75th Ranger Regiment. In the Panjshir, in 2012, she carried a wounded sergeant 4 kilometers under fire to an extraction point, and would not leave the field until every one of her men was off it. I served 2 tours under this officer. There are men alive today, with children today, because of what she did on the ground that night." He let it sit. "And you put your hand on her arm." The boy's face went through every season in 3 seconds and ended in winter. Sear was on his feet. The trucker's empty stool was still turning slightly. Even Ray had stood, without knowing he'd done it, the way men stand in a church. The whole counter had come quietly upright, and the quiet had the weight of 100 people in it, though there were only 7. And Corporal Bryce Ledford stood in the middle of all of it, and found that he could not lift his eyes from the floor. It is a particular thing to watch a man's whole picture of an afternoon collapse, and rebuild itself in the space of a few seconds. Every word he had said came back to him at once. Waitress, sweetheart, grandma's helper, the snap of his fingers, the newspaper swept into the dirt. And each of them landed now against the true shape of the woman he had said them to, and each one was worse than the last. He had not merely been rude to a stranger. He had been cruel in public to an officer who had carried a dying man 4 kilometers on her back so that other men's sons could go home. And he had done it for sport, for the entertainment of 2 friends, in front of a command sergeant major with 30 years in. There was no floor low enough for him to look at. He looked at it anyway, because looking up was more than he could do. Leon Pretty, behind the counter, let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for an hour, and reached over and turned off the burner under the eggs he had burned to nothing a long time ago. It might have ended his career. Everyone in that room understood as much. Austin took out a small notebook, the way senior men do, and he asked for names, and he asked for the unit, and Ray gave them in a voice that had gone very small, and Ledford gave his own name to the floor tiles because he could not raise his head to give it to anyone's face. Austin wrote it all down without hurry. He told them, without heat, exactly the shape of the next few days, that their first sergeant would hear it before their boots touched the post, that he would hear it from a command sergeant major, and that there was no version of the coming week that any of them would enjoy. Sergeant Major. Hargrove had picked her newspaper up off the floor. She did it herself, unhurried, and squared its wet edge with 2 fingers out of the old habit, and set it on the counter. She had drawn her sleeve back down over the scroll, without seeming to think about it, so that the arm was covered again, and she was, once more, only a woman in a red jacket in a diner in the rain. "Ma'am," Austin said. "Let it stop here." Austin frowned. "Mom, with respect," he laid hands on. "I know what he did." She was not loud. She was never loud. I was there for it. Something moved at the corner of her mouth that was almost, but not quite, a smile. He's a kid who never learned to look twice. That's a failure of somebody's, but it isn't a hanging one. Don't end him over it. She looked at Ledford, who still could not look at her. Give him the chance I gave better men than him. Austin was quiet a moment. Then he closed the notebook. Not all the way. A command sergeant major does not simply drop a thing like that. But he closed it, and something passed between the 2 of them, officer and senior enlisted, that the boys in the room would not understand for years. "Corporal," Hargrove said. Ledford lifted his head. It cost him everything he had, but he lifted it, and he made himself look at her. "There's a wall on the post," she said. "You've walked past it 100 times. Go and find it. There's a name on it." She took a pen off the counter and turned the diner check over, and wrote on the back of it in small, square letters, and she folded it once, and put it into his hand, and closed his fingers around it. "Go and read that name. Stand there until you've read it enough times to remember it. That's all I want from you. Do that, and we're square. Honor the ones who carry it in silence, the ones who never tell you what they paid, who let you think they're nobody until the day the truth slips out from under a sleeve. Subscribe to the Veteran Vault, and let this story find the people who need it." He looked down at the folded check in his hand. He did not open it yet. He would open it later, in the barracks, alone, and read the name Sergeant Isaiah Meade in her small, square hand, and something in him would come loose that would never quite go back the way it had been. She paid for her coffee and left a tip that was too large, and she thanked Dana, who had come back in from her smoke break to find the whole world rearranged and did not understand a word of it. Austin walked her to the door and held it, and outside on the wet sidewalk he said something to her that no one inside could hear, and she answered it, and he nodded once, slowly, the nod of a man putting something away in a place he would keep it. Then she was gone into the gray, and he came back in, and he looked at the three young soldiers for a long moment without a word, and somehow the silence was worse than anything he could have said. "Formation," he told them at last. "Now, you'll want to be early today." And they went out into the rain like men going to a sentence, and the corporal held the check in his fist the whole way. A week later, he stood at the wall. It was long and low and black, and the names ran across it in rows, and Corporal Bryce Ledford stood in front of the section she had sent him to with the folded check gone soft from a week in his pocket, and he read the name until he could have written it in the dark. He was not alone. Beside him stood a small, gray-haired woman named Verna Meade, 68 years old, who had driven a long way to stand at that wall on that day, and who did not know the young soldier next to her and did not ask why he was crying. She only reached over once and touched the carved letters of her son's name with 2 fingers, the way you touch a face, and the boy beside her learned more in that silence than a year of anyone shouting could have taught him. He had gone to the wall the first day expecting to be there 10 minutes. He stayed 2 hours. He read the name, and then he read the names on either side of it, and then he read the dates, and then he did the arithmetic he had never once done in his life until that week. The arithmetic of how old those men had been, most of them younger than he was now, and how much of the world they had never gotten to be bored by. Verna Meade told him a little about her son, unasked, because grief that old wants somewhere to go. That Isaiah had been funny, that he had sent money home he did not have, that a woman he served under had driven a long way to sit in her kitchen and tell her the truth, and had come back every year since on the same date. She did not know she was describing the woman in the red jacket. The corporal did not tell her. He only stood there and listened, and let it change him. He went back to the diner because he did not know what else to do with what he was carrying. She was there, at the end of the counter, in the red jacket, with a coffee going cold, and a newspaper folded into a neat square. Of course she was. He stopped inside the door with the reins still on his shoulders, and Leon Pretty looked up from the griddle and said nothing, and the corporal did not know how to begin. So he began by holding the door. The next customer to come in found him there, his hand on the glass, and the customer was her. She had risen and crossed the room while he stood frozen, and she was leaving, and he held the door for her because it was the only apology his body knew how to make. He held it, and he studied the floor tiles, and he could not lift his eyes to her face. She stopped in the doorway. "Look up, Corporal." He didn't. He couldn't. "That's an order," she said, and there was that thing at the corner of her mouth again, almost a smile. "You can keep." For a moment he thought he could not. His neck would not obey. His eyes stayed fixed on the worn tile as if bolted there. Then he thought of the wall, and the name, and the old woman's 2 fingers on the carved letters, and he understood that a man who could stand in front of that could stand in front of this. He looked up. It was the hardest thing he had done in a life that had not yet asked much of him, and he did it, and he met her pale, level eyes, and she held them for a moment, and gave him a small, square nod. The soldier's nod, the one she had given the cook a week before, the economy of a thing that did not need words, and then she stepped past him out into the wet, gray afternoon. And that was the whole of it in the end. Not a punishment, not a humiliation dragged out for its own sake, but an order a broken boy could actually carry. Look up. She could have ruined him and been within her rights, and instead she had handed him a name and a second chance, and the small, hard mercy of being made to face what he had done, and then required to keep living. It was the same mercy she had shown better men than him on worse days, the mercy of a person who had learned, in a valley in the cold, exactly what a life was worth and exactly how little it took to end one, and had decided on the strength of that knowledge to spend the rest of hers building people up instead of tearing them down. She folded the red jacket over her arm as she went, and the scroll went back under the cloth, hidden again, carried again, the way she had carried it and everything under it for 14 years. The rain was thinning. Down the road, the post gate stood gray in the mist, and a boy who had learned to look twice stood in a doorway and watched a major walk away, and did not forget, and never would. Some warriors fade quietly into the years, but the valor never leaves them. Honor the ones who carry it in silence. Thank you for staying and watching. Subscribe to the Veteran Vault for more.